After sprinkling Parmesan over the mouth-watering chicken and spinach tortellini I just made, I scraped half the dish into the sink and turned on the garbage disposal with an irritated sigh. I hated having to throw away half of it each time. The only reason I moved into this apartment was because rent was cheaper after I'd lost my job and nearly burned through my meager savings. It definitely wasn't the suffocating ambience and sketchy neighborhood, and it most definitely wasn't the meal prep boxes left daily at my door. I only learned about those when the previous tenant visited me. Lita dropped by the very same day I moved in. After pointing out the leaky corners I should avoid, suggesting affordable roach traps, and teaching me how to lock the window with a broomstick, she mentioned the boxes. I thought she was kidding, but she was dead serious. I had to prepare dinner each day, dump half in the garbage disposal, and eat the rest right away. She seemed so nonchalant about it, but I wasn't. Who was sending them? Why? What would happen if I refused? She had no solid answers. All she knew was that the previous tenant had told her, which is what they were told by the previous tenant, and so on. Origins unknown. Even the landlord had no idea this was going on, and Lita stressed that I must never tell him. She also stressed that I must never refuse. Why? She said protection, claiming that for as long as she'd lived here, this apartment was never robbed. Was she seriously insinuating that this stupid requirement protected her? She shrugged and said anything was possible. She didn't question the absurdity of it all, but she did question my reluctance. She assured me that she'd eaten from the boxes every day for the years she'd lived here, and they were legit. No prank, no poison, no strings attached. Just dump half in the garbage disposal and eat the rest right away. She began listing the various meals she'd prepared, and my empty stomach growled. I hadn't had a decent meal in days, and it didn't take me long before I caved. Now, after a month of delicious food, my unease had ebbed, but not my disdain. After I turned off the garbage disposal, I grabbed the remaining chicken and spinach tortellini and plopped down on the floor, eating my only meal today. Despite licking the plate clean, my stomach still complained, and I glared at the sink. Half a portion wasn't enough, and I was sick of wasting part of a perfectly good meal, one that I'd worked hard on, no less. I was done following these ridiculous rules. Tomorrow, I was going to eat the whole thing. And I did. For the next week, I prepared and ate the whole meal. And nothing happened. I'll admit it, I was nervous the first few days, but when the world didn't collapse and the boxes kept coming, I felt pretty clever for being the first to break this ridiculous and wasteful trend. As long as the food kept getting delivered right to my door, I was going to eat it. All of it. 8 days later, I realized my actions could have killed me. My bladder woke me up that night and I shambled to the bathroom. After washing my hands, I made my way back to my sleeping bag, and I frowned at an unusual draft. Before I could figure out where it was coming from, a startling force knocked me to the ground. My heart leapt to my throat, and it probably would have jumped out of my mouth if there wasn't a hand smothering my scream. The stench of sweat filled my lungs as I struggled beneath a bony weight, my panic thoughts flashing horrifying scenarios through my mind. A sharp hiss for silence pierced my ear as the cold metal of a gun pressed against my temple, and I abided. Trembling face down on the floor, I held my breath, my eyes wide in fearful anticipation as I heard my attacker grunting and rummaging. I turned my gaze to the open window, and I cursed myself for not propping the broomstick properly as I saw it lying on the floor. In no time, the intruder had shoved a filthy rag in my mouth and yanked my arms behind my back, binding them before he lashed my ankles together. Only then did he take his weight off me and flip me over, his sunken eyes wild under a mess of hair. He was definitely on something, and it was frightening. His actions had no hesitation. He came here for something, and he wasn't leaving without it. The question is, what? The mystery didn't last long as he demanded to know where I hid my valuables. I stared at him in disbelief. Did he not see the squalor I was living in? I didn't even have any furniture. Did he think I had cash stuffed in my frayed sleeping bag? Gold hidden in the rusty oven? Diamonds stashed behind the broken radiator? My baffled silence wasn't the answer he was looking for, and as I cried out, he punched me in the face. He lifted his fist again, and I flinched, whimpering through my gag, as I nodded towards my meager possessions, my wallet and my phone. He crawled over to them, and I crawled away, tears stinging my eyes as my cheek throbbed to the rhythm of my stuttering heart. I was certain $11.25 and a phone with the cracked screen wouldn't be enough to appease him. He seemed desperate. Desperate enough to kill. I had to save myself before it was too late. As he tore through my wallet in frustration, I made my way to the kitchen, my eyes on the drawers. I just needed a knife to cut through these bonds, and I could make a run for it. Balancing on my knees, I bent over and reached up with my hands, my trembling fingers searching for the handle. Gripping it, I pulled. But it didn't move. This was the worst time for it to stick. I wiggled it as I always do, but my position was less than optimal, and the drawer refused to budge. After a particularly forceful yank, I lost my balance and fell with a grunt, and my terrified eyes turned toward the door as the intruder stomped in, gun aimed at me. I screamed and cowered against the cupboards, my heart slamming against my ribcage as the blood drained from my face. And then the blood drained from his face. I followed his petrified gaze, and I screamed even louder as an unholy creature erupted from the sink. It towered over us like a giant furry centipede, pointy legs bristling from its long, inky body and spikes jutting out of its mouth. With a lurching motion, looking almost as if it was falling, it descended upon the intruder, silencing his scream with a stab straight through his throat. It didn't silence my screams, though, and I continued to shriek through my gag as the monster continued to stab the man, its sharp legs jabbing at him like a macabre typewriter. It was facing away, but that didn't stop the spraying blood from dotting every surface of the kitchen, including me. After a few final jabs, the monster stopped puncturing the intruder, and I watched in horror as it began sliding its mutilated body into its mouth. Its legs tapping against the cracked tiles with excitement, as though this was the first meal it had in ages. It devoured its kill the way a snake would, completely whole, and vomit fought my screams as it burned my throat. Once the last of the man had disappeared, the creature gulped a few times and began spasming. For a hopeful moment, I thought it was choking and dying. But to my terrified dismay, I realized it was crushing the body within its own as I heard bones snap and grind. Its convulsing stopped, and the shock stole my screams as I watched its sharp legs retract into its blood-soaked fur. It now looked more like a giant fluffy caterpillar than a centipede, and my raspy breaths raced my pulse as I fearfully waited to see what it would do next. I stared in fraught disbelief as the monster began slithering across the floor, lapping up every blood of drop it came across before it stretched itself to reach the counters, walls, and ceiling. It was a lot more coordinated after eating, and what amplified my unease is soon only my corner was left, and it turned to me, giving me my first clear view of its face. It wasn't what I had expected. I'd imagined pincers, antennas, and compound eyes, but instead, I saw a rounded snout, floppy ears, and deep scars where its eyes should be. In any other scenario, it might have passed for cute, but right now, all it did was reboot my vocal cords as it slithered closer. My muffled screams echoed as I pressed against the cupboards, petrified, but it didn't seem to care as it licked up the blood around me. When it began licking me, my heart almost stopped beating. Right then and there, I was certain I was next on the menu. And then, it nuzzled me. I peeked through my eyelids, gulping, and I frowned in uneasy confusion as it curled up beside me, laying its large head on my lap. Slowly, I allowed my screams to stop, my tense body quivering with adrenaline. It had murdered my attacker, cleaned up the crime scene, and now it was snuggling? A knock on the door startled us as my neighbors asked if I was alright, and I gasped, afraid the monster would go after them. To my surprise, it shrank away instead, slithering towards the sink and stretching itself thin before wiggling down the drain. The door crashed open and my neighbors ran in, the look on their faces matching mine as they saw me bound in the corner, quaking with shock. After they freed me and I found my voice, I mentioned the robber, but I gave him a happier ending, as I claimed he had ran away. As much as the creature terrified me, it saved my life, and I didn't want to get in trouble. Besides, who'd believe me? Maybe Lita would. I decided to call her in the morning, but that what left me up all night thinking. Was that creature the thing we'd been feeding all this time? Was Lita right? Was it here to protect us? Was it too weak to scare off the robber before he attacked me because I'd unintentionally starved it for over a week? And despite all that, did it care for me that much that it didn't eat me, saved my life, and snuggled? I hope that was the case. The creature didn't seem malevolent towards me, but there were still so many unanswered questions and uncertainties that I hoped Lita could answer. She couldn't. I didn't mention the monster right away, afraid she'd be clueless and think I was insane. Instead, I asked if she knew what was protecting us and if anything unusual slithered out of the kitchen sink. She said our daily ritual protected us, a modern version of ancient sacrifices to the gods. And then she suggested I ask the landlord to fix my pest issues. I still had no answers. Too poor to leave the apartment and not willing to tempt fate, I decided to continue dumping half the meal in the garbage disposal. If that creature was going to protect me, I had to stay on its good side. The next day, I carried the box to the kitchen, pinned the recipe to my fridge, and began preparing a spicy salmon pizza, keeping a wary eye on the sink. As I turned to the recipe, running my finger down the instructions, it slipped from beneath the magnet and fell to the floor. This happened every once in a while, but this time, the glossy paper disappeared beneath the fridge. Not willing to stick my hand under there, I grabbed a wire coat hanger, stretched it out, and began fishing. I recovered a medley of cereal crumbs, a fossilized chicken wing, a pen cap, a used car salesman business card, 2 dead roaches, my recipe, and a strange yellowed paper. Curious, I dusted it off and read it, my eyes expanding with every word. December 11th, 2013. Dear Tenant, I moved into this apartment to care for my savior. I was a hunter, you see, and I had terminal cancer. I was reckless, and I didn't care when death would choose to take me. But Alesta cared. She protected me when I challenged a bear, appearing out of the blue and nearly dying herself. No one had ever done for me what she did, and I was moved by her selflessness. Alesta got injured and lost her eyesight. She was no longer able to hunt, and I felt responsible. I invited her to live with me. With the last of my savings, I signed up for 10 years of a meal prep program. I know I won't live that long. She may not either, but I still ask you, dear tenant, to continue honoring her. Every evening, prepare the meal and leave it in the cupboard under the sink. Then go to sleep. The next morning, if the plate is still full, do with it as you wish. But if the plate is empty, don't be alarmed. Just continue to honor my savior, and you'll be safe and secure as long as you live here. Dear tenant, this is all I ask of you, fulfilling a grateful man's dying wish. Please don't mention this to anyone, especially not the landlord. But if you end up moving out, please hand this letter to the new tenant. And when the 10 years are up on December 11th, 2023, please, my friend, consider renewing. Alesta deserves it. Thank you, and be blessed. Callum. I put the letter down, stunned. The creature truly was a protector. Alesta, brought here to be cared for by a man with little time. Callum put a lot of faith in a bunch of strangers, but I guess he didn't have a choice. He could have at least told us what we were dealing with, but maybe he didn't trust we'd have Alesta's best interest at heart. I was surprised we'd all follow the rule despite how cryptic it was. Well, at least until I came along. I looked at the letter again. Would I have been more inclined to abide if I'd received this? I'll never know, because one of the previous tenants misplaced it and passed on the message verbally, the request changing from person to person like a game of telephone until we were feeding Alesta half her intended meal through the garbage disposal. Well, that wasn't going to happen anymore, and I didn't want Alesta to hide anymore either. She saved my life, and I wanted to improve hers. After preparing the spicy salmon pizza, I placed it on the kitchen floor and sat cross-legged in front of it, working up the courage. I cleared my throat and called out her name. Alesta? A soft gurgle sounded from the drain. Alesta. Dinner. Food. Yummy food. I'd never met a creature like Alesta before, and I had no idea how intelligent she was. Come out. It's okay. You don't have to eat in the drain anymore. You can live out here with me. I held my breath as she poked her head out of the sink, her nose sniffing the air. Hey, Alesta. She gurgled again. She seemed to like hearing her name. The one her only friend had given her. Well, now she had another friend. I gestured to the pizza and smiled before I remembered she couldn't see. This pizza is all for you. I looked down with regret. I'm sorry I didn't feed you last week. I'll never do that again. I couldn't help but tense up as she slithered over, her long, slender body compressing into a bulbous form as she settled in front of me. This was going to take some getting used to. She smelled like rust and old lettuce, and I hoped she wasn't averse to baths now that she didn't have to hide anymore. 2 pointy legs protruded from her fur, and she poked around blindly until she found the plate. I watched in surprise as she split the pizza and slid half over to me. And I pushed it back. No, it's all for you, like Callum wanted. As I said that, my stomach growled, and Alesta chirped in response and slid half towards me again. She picked up a slice and began nibbling, and I smiled, teary-eyed as I reached for my own slice. For the first time ever, I was glad I'd lost my job, and once I get a new one, neither of us will go hungry again.